And welcome to Libertarian Counterpoint. I am your host, James Just, and with me today is Mr. Jason McPhee from the Knuckleheads of Liberty. Jason, one of the things that has disturbed us as a group, as people who believe in libertarian values, is the politicization of everyday life, right? As more and more as we go along, we've long discussed about how the explosion of the size and scope of government is bad for society, but it's not just the size and scope. It's that as we navigate our way through life, these institutions, the things we have to touch, are becoming politicized more and more and more. And one of these great ways to highlight this is in Oklahoma. The Oklahoma Superintendent of Schools warns math publishers that they can go to California if they can't teach math without CRT. Now the question is, you've got politicization of both sides of this issue, right? Because now you've had the left, we'll call it the left for, to make things easy, has been politicizing education for a long time. And so now the right is pushing back with their own politicization of education. And there's nowhere this can end up but in a big trash heap of burning refuse, right? There's no good way this turns out.
Well, I mean, this is the problem too, when you say the more general issue is the over-politicization of everything. And the problem here is that we have government in everything. So if government's in everything, everything's going to be politicized because you have these scarce resources and everybody wants to have their say on how they're being used. So, the libertarian position here is not so much to teach CRT in math or not teach CRT in math. It's to literally say, get the government out of it. And if you want to go to a little school that decides that CRT needs to be in your math, well, ultimately that's your problem. I mean, it's your choice, but ultimately that will be your problem too. But the bottom line is, I don't want to make that choice for you. You should be making that choice for you. So, this is what kills me, is the liberty position is so simple and it solves almost all these politicization problems, and it would help to diffuse so much of the division in our country if we could just get government out of most things.
Yeah, because the thing about once you get government in, you get people in and they have ideas, right? And then, well, we need to do this. We need to, God, we've spent, ever since as long as I can remember, so we're talking late 70s, if we've always been doing some form of school reform, right? They'll do school reform, education reform, and then 5 years later you do education reform, and 3 years later you do another round of education reform.
Education reform 20.0.
At some point, you've never let the first reforms take effect before you reformed and you're just adding program on top of program on top of program. And now we have in Oregon, where they've essentially said there is now no standards for graduation. You don't have to pass a test. You just graduate if you, I guess, show up to class enough, if even that. So now 83% of it's a now new record, 83% of high school students in Oregon have now graduated. Well, yeah, if you can just graduate them by signing their name and say, hey, congratulations. 40% of you can't read, 38% of you can't do math, but you're graduating anyway.
Well, imagine, what other area of life would you go into and say, I have no standard for how I spend my money. I am going to go buy dinner and, hey, whatever the heck happens at the end when the waiter brings it, that's cool, I guess. I don't know. The bottom line is you're going to have an expectation that if you ordered something on that menu that you're going to get that and that you're going to enjoy it, or you wouldn't be there. Unfortunately, when government gets involved, it's sort of like, well, they take your money anyways. They really don't care whether you get the product at the end or not. There doesn't appear to be much of any kind of a standard other, even what they maybe call food in the restaurant, I don't know. But this is a crazy thing, right? This education that's coming out, and these kids are graduating, and it's like, well, what standard had they even met? If an employer was looking at that kid and he said, oh, I have this diploma, what does it even mean at this point if there's no measurable metric of what they got out of it? So it goes back to math too, by the way.
And I actually can understand, there is a point, right? Not all children, standardized tests don't reflect necessarily what you know. Some people don't take tests well. But you're talking a relative minority. You can actually deal with those students individually while still having the tests be useful for everybody else. And you can actually, in an individualized education, you would know this because you would know the child. And you can say, look, this child doesn't take tests well, but look, through all of this work they do, through whether they sit down and do a in-person a verbal essay or a verbal test, where you sit down and actually have a conversation with somebody so someone can actually figure out what do you actually know and what you don't, and there's ways around this type of problem, but instead we're just saying we don't want to essentially what they're saying is we can't educate these kids, and so rather than hold them to a standard, rather than hold ourselves to a standard, we're just going to fail all these kids by passing them. And because that's what you've done. You failed all these kids by passing them.
Yeah, you failed society too. but this is a crazy thing. I mean, regardless of what the metric is of success, ultimately the biggest metric is how did these kids do 5 or 10 years after they leave that school? Are they doing well? And eventually that's the metric that parents are going to use if it's a choice scenario. So, to sit there and say, well, how will we decide how well the kids are doing? Well, I think parents will kind of figure it out they'll see, hey, kids who went to that school, they're all becoming doctors and lawyers, and kids who are going to that school over there, they're still having problems figuring the square peg in the round hole. That's the government school over there.
Yeah. And there's many ways to educate the schools. In some Nordic countries, they don't teach their children reading and writing until they're 7 or 8, 9 even, because they want them to play, they want them to learn the basics of, being a human around other human beings before they try to educate them about, math and science. And because how much is a 5-year-old going to understand math and science anyway? They may be able to memorize things, but they're not going to understand it. And so they wait until they can actually understand it. And it seems to me that there's so many other ways that we can actually teach children, and instead of focusing on those and helping those, like homeschooling has increased in the last, 4 years, like 51%, and it's growing even more rapidly, and especially since the pandemic, and it's because children, one, they found out what the schools weren't teaching them, what they were and weren't teaching them, and two, they found out that homeschooling isn't actually that hard. It's hard, but it's actually rewarding. Let me get that straight. It's very, very difficult, but it's also very rewarding, which makes it not such a burden. See, what people are afraid of is that homeschooling is a burden, right? It's hard. It's a very hard, difficult task, but because it's your child and you're helping them grow and to become the person they want to be, and you're helping them, it's very rewarding, and you go to bed at night and exhausted, but hopeful. And I think that's what we've lost in public schools, and this politicization of public schools is that we've lost hope.
Well, one of the other funny things when you brought up what the lockdown showed us about public schools as well, it really took away the myth that it's all about the kids, right? The idea that, hey, everything's being done for the kids. It really turned out the kids were a secondary consideration. Everybody got paid. The only people who got shortchanged were the kids. So,
yeah. Before we move on, there is one thing. Our schools work for nobody but the bureaucrat. They don't work for the parents. They don't work for the children. And they don't work for our teachers. Our teachers are miserable. The only people who are happy are the administrators. And administrators, central planners, experts are warning to halt installation of fake grass because it's bad for the environment. So now these same people who were 10 years ago telling us, pull out your yards, pull out your lawns, and replace it with some fake grass to save water and to save the environment, and now saying, well, we shouldn't do that because it's bad for the environment because microplastics are getting into the environment. And so what can we do? If human beings exist, we're going to have an impact on the environment around us because every animal that exists has an impact on the environment around us. But trying to listen to these central planners and then just react to what they say has led us down a primrose path of destruction, have they not?
Well, and this is the ultimate thing where whether we're talking about CRT in the schools or, rip out your grass and install, fake grass, and then lo and behold, the unintended consequences of all of these hazardous materials working their way from the grass, the fake grass, the one the government told you to put into your in front of your house, all of those hazardous materials now going down to your stormwater and infecting your rivers and all that. I mean, these are the brainiacs, the planners who put us on that path. It goes to show the lack of humility with the central planner types and what libertarianism is all about. It's really about humility. It's saying that we really don't know what the best way is to plan for you, but you put price signals on things and kind of let you make the choices and figure it out yourself. And that's kind of the way that seems to work best and allow the most freedom.
Rather, yeah, give people as much information as possible, right? Information should essentially be freely available. And with that information and with pricing signals, you can say, okay, here's the choices we have. Because in some places, if you're in a desert and you want to have someplace that looks nice and green, well, rain isn't really that much of a problem, right? You're only getting maybe an inch of rain a year. And so you're not actually causing that. Maybe you're not going to cause that much environmental damage. Now, if you're putting in fake grass and you're living in, say, the Pacific Northwest where it rains 30 inches a year, you're going to have it's a lot different issue. But then again, you're not really wasting water because water isn't really an issue. You get enough rain to take care of your lawn. And so rather than the planners, as planners say, well, you should do this. I'm like, well, water isn't an issue in my area. I can grow grass. Hey, there's no rain in my area, so I can put fake grass in and get to see something green, have some place for my kids to comfortably play without really endangering the environment.
This is the ultimate hubris, too, of these planners, because not only do they think they know what the best solution is for everybody, but they're assuming then that everybody's values are all the same. And the point is that, maybe a lawn matters 5 times as much to me as it does to James, or vice versa. And so, in that case, if as long as I'm paying for the extra cost of the water to water that lawn, why not just let me do that, right? I mean, if water's scarce, let prices tell us they're scarce. So those are the, that's the way we can kind of self-regulate and leave it up to people to figure out for themselves.
Yeah, it is. It's that this notion that these central planners know what the future holds, that they think they know what the future holds, when the reality is history has proven that they don't. Central planners are actually the worst people to know what the future holds. They literally are. And
as if lockdowns didn't show us all that.
And speaking of lockdowns and showing us that, and maybe a bit of I told you so, we have a report from Mr. Richard Fields, who's got something to say to you all that you may not like to hear, or maybe our audience will like to hear. Anyway, from the fields, we've got, let's see what Richard has to say.
Here's an interesting quote. In the US and UK, lockdowns went from being regarded as something that only an authoritarian government would attempt to an example of following the science. But never was there any science behind lockdowns. Not a single study had ever been undertaken to measure their efficacy in stopping a pandemic. When you got right down to it, lockdowns were little more than a giant experiment. The rant of some far-right conspiracy theorist, hoax-claiming anti-science nut, right? Wrong. This is a quote of New York Times veteran Joe Nocera and Vanity Fair contributing editor Bethany McLean. They even say of Dr. Fauci, and I quote, what he could never acknowledge was that shutting things down didn't stop the virus, and keeping schools closed didn't save kids' lives. Then again, to understand that, you had to be willing to follow the science. Remember, this is a mainstream media talking, the mouthpiece of the preferred government narrative. Of course, we libertarian wackos have been singing this song since, about March of 2020, when California issued the first lockdown order. Shortly after, people on this show said that, one, with a 98% recovery rate, COVID was no more lethal than the, 1968 flu, and did not warrant the panic it was generating. Two, the vast majority of the deaths related to COVID were occurring among old people or those who were already severely ill. That it would make sense to quarantine those at high risk, but it made no sense at all to lock down the rest of the population. Not to mention that it violated pretty much the gamut of civil liberties: freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of movement, freedom of commerce, and ultimately freedom of speech and of the press. All gone with one deep state administrative edict. No democracy involved. We also pointed out that the FDA totally reversed its normal, slow, plodding, ultra-conservative pace in approving new medicines, in approving not one, but 3 anti-COVID vaccines. Turns out the truncated drug approval process missed some significant but rare, about 1 in 10,000 side effects like myocarditis. I got the vaccinations and am even participating in some of the ongoing vaccine trials. But given the dramatically shortened drug approval process, forcing the young and healthy to get the jab or lose their job, right to travel, etc., was never morally justified. Not to mention the fact that 95% efficacy was nonsense from the beginning. I don't have to go into all of the fiscal and monetary policy nonsense that resulted from the COVID panic, but rip-roaring inflation now and for years to come, and 2 years of missed education for our youngsters is just the tip of the iceberg. I hate to say I told you so, but I told you so. In unhedged language, at the time it was happening. This is Richard Fields with a report from the fields. Here's an
You know, Richard makes a good point about he's participating in trials, right? He's participating in some trials of these vaccine trials, but he's doing it by choice, right? And if millions of people had wanted to participate in what was essentially a vaccine trial, they should have the freedom to do so. Most libertarians believe in the right to try. But the right to try also comes with the right to refuse, the right to say no. And that's something that, for some reason, because COVID had the response to COVID, it wasn't COVID itself, the response to COVID, that the right to say no disappeared. And I think that's something that we don't actually discuss enough, not here on the show, not in society in general, has that right to say no been diminished?
Yeah, and it certainly appears that it's being diminished every time they come out with a new authoritarian edict. It seems to be, what's in the public interest? It's never in. It seems to me the biggest public interest is what each individual holds in their own interest, and yet they never seem to figure that out. They always want to apply a one-size-fits-all to everybody. But the biggest thing I thought about the lockdowns that was the biggest disappointment is, in a country that supposedly stands for individual liberty. I mean, that's supposed to be sort of our history, right? Is that, what the founding fathers supposedly were about. And yet it was Sweden that was actually the country that is a little more socialist than us. They were the ones who were actually standing up and saying, "Hey, this is a little bit crazy. We're not gonna lock everything down." And yet, Trump was kind of saying, "Hey, we do lockdowns better than everybody here."
Well, Sweden's one of the most armed populace in the world, right? So maybe there's a little bit to that. People who are armed are more prepared to take care of themselves. Maybe, I don't know. You're coming from someone who does not own arms. So, I don't actually know. But this is what we allowed to happen is things that most of us, at least people of my age, we thought we'd never come to see. We'd never come to see where the government could force us, by virtue of a signature, force us to stay in our homes, close businesses, and rewrite the rules of society overnight. And that's what happened. And it's quite disturbing. Another thing that's quite disturbing, we've got this whole Trump cases going on, and we don't care that much about this whole thing here. It's a whole big kerfuffle, right? And a pox on all their houses is kind of, I don't really care if these people go to jail or not. I'm just tired of, our resources getting wasted. And apparently so is a judge. A judge scolded Jack Smith, I guess it's a couple weeks ago now, because he was wasting her time with kind of silly motions, not giving Trump evidence that they were supposed to, just kind of dragging their heels and then filing a motion for one of Trump's defendants, asking if he had, if the defendant knew there was a potential conflict of interest for using the same lawyer Trump was using. And he's asking the judge to have a hearing over this.
And I don't think it was the exact same lawyer. I think it was just simply that a political action committee
is paying for it?
Exactly, that was somehow tied to Trump. And so there may have been a conflict of interest. But, the bottom line is conflict of interest. Look at the conflict of interest of every single one of these prosecutions going after Trump. I mean, literally people who ran for office saying that I'm running on finding something to put Trump in jail for. and then then lo and behold, they're charging him with something. To me, that sounds like quite a conflict of interest, and yeah, it's just...
And again, I've always said my biggest problem with these whole Trump prosecutions, and we're only going to stay a minute, isn't the Trump prosecution themselves, is that they've gone after it with a lot of political vigor that they have not done with others.
Yeah.
And that's the part that actually bothers me. If this stuff really, if the stuff that Trump has done has really bothered you, then there's a laundry list of people in D.C. that need to be, have given the proverbial rectal exam, and they're not doing it. In fact, they're doing the exact opposite. They're protecting them. They're hiding. They're slow walking investigations, if at all. They're getting special treatments for.
Well, and just to hammer that note down, the one thing, if you're not sure, and you should look it up if you're watching this show, if you don't believe us, but go back and look at what the first impeachment was about. The first impeachment had to do with Donald Trump, Ukraine, and him interfering with their governance by telling them to reinstate a prosecutor to look into stuff that Biden had been doing. Well, guess what? That's exactly what Biden was doing when he was vice president, and it was literally the same case. It was the same prosecutor issue. All of that, and yet not a peep. Nobody was interested in looking into Biden's actions when he was vice president in Ukraine, even though he's on tape in this, gosh, I think it's called Foreign Affairs or something like that. It's one of these think tanks, and he's bragging about the fact that he got a prosecutor fired in Ukraine by threatening to withhold aid. So, I mean, this is all the exact same thing, and yet, like you said, that they're not applying the laws equally. And maybe they should be going after both, but certainly just going after one looks like that justice has been weaponized.
It makes it look like justice is weaponized, even if it's not. They may think that they're not weaponizing, but if they think they're not weaponizing government, it's because they're so far on one side that they actually can't see it. A lot of these people who are far on the left or far on the right, they think they're the center. And that's actually one of the most dangerous things, is someone who's a left extremist or a right-wing extremist who thinks they're the center. That's where actually danger comes from. Now, one of the things we've talked about in the last few years is election fraud has been up in the news a lot, and especially Trump and election deniers. And our thing is election fraud exist? Yes, but most election fraud is local, and there's 2 Democrats who've been charged with election fraud. They're essentially got caught with manipulating ballots. They've been essentially what many of us have claimed about mail-in ballots. Mail-in ballots are not secure. And
this was in New Jersey, so just so you know, and it's an election between 2 Democrats.
Yeah. So this is how most actually, when you talk about election fraud, this is the type of election fraud that mostly exists. It's not these big, huge, vast conspiracies of election fraud. Those are almost impossible to pull off, right? This kind of stuff you can actually pull off, and so this is the kind of election fraud that happens. And the problem is we don't highlight this. Yes, there's a news story, but why isn't it national news? Why aren't we saying this is the kind of election fraud we have to look out for? Hey, these mail-in ballots, the chain of custody is a problem with mail-in ballots. And why don't we look into that? I've always complained about mail-in ballots, that they're the least secure, most expensive, and slowest way to vote. And so why are we doing it this way? I get it. If someone is housebound or they're on a trip or traveling and they need to vote, great, fine. Absentee ballots, and you can mail them in. That's great. But for the rest of us, we should actually have to vote. Go down somewhere and vote. It's just the most secure way to do it.
Well, but one of the other crazy things, and this goes right back into this sort of the weaponization of government thing again, but in this particular case, remember I believe it was Trump first got elected in 2016. That was his first one, mm-hmm. right? And so back then, Democrats were all about saying, hey, there could be election fraud here. And then suddenly, when Trump got elected, or rather when Trump wound up being the person who was saying, hey, there might be election fraud, then suddenly anybody who said that was an election denier. And it's absolutely crazy. And in this particular case, is the judge an election denier? I mean, you have these 2 people who were both Democrats on the city council. I think one was a mayor and one was a city councilman. But one was literally going and taking the ballots and trashing the ones that weren't for him and refilling them out, and the other was paying some people to request fraudulent ballots and then filling those out. So, and we're talking in the thousands too. So
Yeah,
it wasn't just like a few, 5 or 10. They just got a friend to do it. This was in the thousands, so it was enough to.
And another quote this brings up is, these
And
are
2020, by the way.
Yeah, 2020. But you're risking your whole life. You're risking behind bars, massive fines, and all these stuff for a mayorship. How is any mayor worth that? What's the real value? It's not like they get paid that much.
Makes you wonder.
What's the real value of these mayor jobs, isn't it? All right, so we've got about 2 minutes left. So let's talk a minute about the Constitution. We've got an article here that says it's Democrats who don't believe in the Constitution. I personally don't think the Democrats or Republicans really care all that much about the Constitution until it suits their purpose. I think that's been kind of a proven fact. But I do think Democrats, in a sense, may be more dangerous because they are willing to reinvent the Constitution at will. At least Republicans kind of pretend to care, but Democrats will reinvent the meaning at the drop of a hat.
And this kind of goes back to kind of what the Scalia stuff, being a originalist versus somebody who believes it's a living document. And, it's true that not all the words were very well defined back then. When you say unreasonable, well, what the heck does that mean? So there's some things that we do still have to try and figure out how to interpret. But we don't want words that are clear to be reinterpreted just based upon how we feel about those words today.
Because they were agreed on, voted on, and approved. Approved, and voted on, right?
Yeah.
For what they meant then. And so if you want to change the meaning, you have to go back through the process. There is a process to change the Constitution. I mean, and this one, Governor Newsom is a moron. But sorry, he wants to have a
enough time for this.
He wants to have a constitutional convention to redo the Second Amendment. You don't need a constitutional convention to redo the Second Amendment. You just go through and make an amendment. A constitutional convention would it essentially throws out the Constitution, and you get an opportunity to rewrite the whole freaking thing. And so is that really what they wanted to do, or is they just want to reimagine the Second Amendment?
I think
what's his real plan?
He was really after a virtue signal because, he could easily do what he wants in California. The issue is, on a national stage, he would have to really get a lot more push to do what he wants to do, and he knew that wasn't going to happen anyways, so this was all just one big virtue signal on his point to try and say, hey everybody, I'm the most anti-gun person.
Well, virtue signaling is something California Democrats are great at doing, but if anybody looks around California, it's a mess and they're not good at running things. We are out of time. Thank you, Jason, for being here. Thank you for watching. We will see you next week. Thanks to the crew inside there for working hard. We will see you next week. Please remember to love everybody and good night.